Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. I'm confused, really confused. I'm having trouble understanding the U.S., New York State, and New York City's economic and fiscal situation, how we got here and how we get out. There are too many contradictory diagnoses and prescriptions. It reminds me of my favorite song lyric from the 60s. Something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. Hopefully, to help clear my troubled mind is James Parrott, Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Fiscal Policy Institute. The Institute deals with economic, fiscal, and budgetary policy issues and works to increase understanding of New York State's tax system and the adequacy of state and local public services. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Doug.
2 years ago, you came on the set, and I was confused then. I'm still confused. We have a new governor who just delivered his State of the State message. We have a president who's reorganizing his economic policy team, and I'm still not sure of what's going on. The indicators look good. Talk about the general state of the U.S. economy, where we're headed.
We have an economy that's fundamentally still in a recession. Unemployment is well over 9%. We've had a little bit of job growth, but far from what we need, even to bring the unemployment rate down, or to keep it the same, not to mention to get back the 8 million jobs that we lost over the last couple of years. So we have a national economy that's where there should be a real sense of urgency about how to fix it, but Washington is not focused on that. They're focused instead on the deficit now, which they made a whole lot worse by extending taxes for high-income people.
Okay, explain the logic. I don't get the logic. I mean, and I presume you don't appreciate
I don't know. I don't understand the logic
Okay.
on their part. But, except that, what's clear is that the Republicans' road to victory in November, because the economy is in the tank and it's creating a lot of suffering out there. That doesn't mean that they won because they have a plan to fix the economy. In fact, they have a plan to keep the economy bad for 2 more years so they can retake the White House.
Ooh.
Now, the Democrats should sense that, all Democrats, including Democrats here in New York State. One would like to see our governor sort of present a perspective on the federal budget situation and the economy that would lead us out of the mess that we're in. We need more stimulus. Part of which would take the form of more aid to state and local governments. New York State is not alone in facing a big budget crisis. 46 states have severe budget problems. And proportionally, New York's is not even in the top 10 as it is.
$10 billion?
$10 billion. It's a serious problem. Now, we're only going to address that in a meaningful way if there's more relief. If there's more stimulus from Washington to get the economy going again, put people back to work, bring down unemployment, restore some wage-based purchasing power in the economy. That's the heart and soul of the American economy.
Is this likely? I mean, are we going to see
It's not in the cards
stimulus
right now, but everybody needs to be talking about that. We need to have a governor that focuses on that. A lot of things need to happen in order to address a $10 billion budget, but there really has to be an encompassing perspective where every major stakeholder needs to come to the table. There needs to be a true sense of shared sacrifice on this. But we haven't seen that at this point.
But didn't the governor in the State of the State message articulate that very point, bringing the stakeholders together to at least advise him?
Right, and at least in the area of Medicaid reform, that it does appear to be what he's doing. But we've got to do it in other areas. We've got to do it in terms of school aid. We have to do it in terms of how we pay for the services that we need. We're in a very severe recession. We have very high unemployment, including in New York State. It's around 8%. It's not coming down rapidly. We've had a heightened level of demand for services in this recession. There's a lot more homeless. The food stamp rolls have increased a lot. Medicaid roll. 1 million New Yorkers lost employer-provided health insurance in 2009. That's part of what's driving this tremendous increase in Medicaid expenses. The real driving force, though, is the likely ending, the winding down of the increased federal share of Medicaid. That's a big problem that only Washington can really address. But we've got these heightened needs. We need to figure out, a balanced approach to address this, including looking at the revenue side.
Okay, let's talk about the revenue side. Let's talk about tax policy. What is current tax policy? Are taxes constraining New York's recovery? That seems to be the major argument.
Our tax problem in New York State is mainly one of regressivity, meaning that middle and lower income people pay a higher share of their income in state and local taxes than high income people do. I know this is not what you usually hear.
No.
In fact,
this is very counter-conventional wisdom here.
Many political leaders talk about how we can't raise taxes or we can't keep taxes high on high-income people because they have a lot of options and they'll move. Well, the fact is that they pay less than their proportionate share of income in state and local taxes. They pay less, in fact, than people on the bottom quintile of income, people with incomes that average $20,000 a year or less in New York State.
Okay.
And
Go ahead.
This tax picture ignores sort of the elephant in the room of the U.S. economy in the last 30 years, this hyper concentration of income growth at the top. That makes the regressivity problem greater because living standards for most people at the middle and the bottom haven't risen over the last 20 years. If you look at New York State's economic growth, we've had about 2.5% economic growth, gross domestic product measured at a state level, has increased. We've had ups and downs in the economy, but over the last 20 years, it's grown by about 2.5% a year. There's been a lot of growth. Has that growth been broadly shared? Absolutely not. 95% of that growth is concentrated in the hands of the 1% or 5% at the very top. The top 1% in New York account for 45% of all income. In 1980, it was about 12%.
The counter-argument might be that 1%, if you raise their taxes and leave, presuming that that's a motivating factor, which the evidence doesn't seem to suggest, then you don't want to tax them because they are putting in that much money.
A lot of states, as I mentioned before, 46 states are in the same position that New York is in. A lot of them are responding in ways, along the lines of what New York has. They've raised some revenues, they've raised taxes, they've raised fees in recent years. Because to totally eviscerate what a state does, leaves you so unprepared and underfinanced that you can't sustain a productive economy.
Okay.
What New York's leaders need to understand is that, our taxes are high, but we get something in return for that. What we get is the most productive economy in the United States. If you look at GDP, the value of goods and services produced in New York, per worker, it's higher in New York State than it is in any of the 10 largest states. So, we have a highly urbanized economy. It's very productive. It takes a high level of infrastructure investment and a high level of public safety and other public services to sustain a highly productive economy.
So a lot of what we're hearing out there is, in your mind, at least in terms of the data that you present, lies, damn lies, and statistics, quoting Twain.
Well, there are people who have a motivation to try and shrink government to the point where you can drown it in a bathtub, what Grover Norquist said.
Right.
And, we had an economic crisis in 2007, 2008 that was the result of forces that had developed over a long period of time. And it was clearly concentrated, emanated from the financial sector. So our solutions responding to that economic crisis, no, our solutions are now focused on government as if it created all of those problems. Now, I would certainly fault government for not effectively regulating what the finance sector and the overall economic policy. But to say that government was the cause of the economic problems is just beyond credibility.
And also, I mean, the fact that, this may sound self-serving, that public employees are sort of the bête noirs of this story. Robert Reich did a post in the Huffington Post on January 5th titled "The Shameful Attack on Public Employees." And he talks about bad data, twisted evidence, and unsupported assertions. Right. Talk about the impact of public employee pensions, healthcare, all of that stuff that represents sort of the current thinking out there.
You know, if you look at the level of benefits and pensions and compensation the public sector gets, you know, it puts them squarely in the middle class. But albeit it's a very, rapidly shrinking middle class in this country. It used to be that we had a much broader middle class and that many private sector workers had benefits, had health benefits and pensions like public sector workers have now. Because through economic changes and national policies and decisions of large corporations to shrink those benefits over time, we're now to the point where it looks like public sector workers are better off than most middle class workers, most private sector workers. But the solution shouldn't be, all right, so let's ratchet down what public sector workers get and shrink the middle class further. To me, again, if you keep in mind this long-term income concentration picture, we should be seeking policies that expand the middle class, not shrink it. Now, there's no question that healthcare costs for retired public sector workers is rising, but that's part of our debt problem at the national level. We have a healthcare problem in this country. We need to have viable solutions that address that. When you look at the United States compared to other developed countries, our healthcare cost burden is totally out of line and is the fundamental driving force, one of the fundamental driving forces in confining the U.S. to second-class status as an economic power. We have to get healthcare costs under control. I mean, that affects the rising Medicaid rolls, that affects the future liabilities for retiree health care. It affects a lot of things in our economy, and we have to have meaningful solutions to address that.
When you were here the last time, you made the comment that an economic crisis is, quote, a terrible thing to waste. Looking back 2 years, have we wasted it?
We've not only wasted it, but we've substituted a false analysis about what the problem is, what I was just talking about a minute ago. This was an economic crisis fundamentally rooted in a deregulated financial sector that had taken over the larger economy. So it seemed like one possible outcome of all of this is that we would have, we would be resigned, or we would decide that we need to have a better balanced approach to regulating the financial sector so that we can get more sustained growth and more rapid growth in the private economy. You know, here we are 2 years later. We've had financial sector reform, but we don't have the recovery in lending. We have a lot of small businesses that can't get the financing they need. We have over 9% unemployment. We still have serious economic problems. So we have squandered that opportunity, and in its place, we've put a mistaken analysis of the crisis that says that it's big government at the federal level, at the state level.
Okay, let's go back to the state level. Talk about tax policy. One of the centerpieces of the governor's State of the State address and of his campaign was this property tax cap.
Right.
Talk about that cap and other tax policies and what their potential impacts are.
You know, the property tax revolt has taken root in New York over the last 10 or 12 years as a consequence of a policy that George Pataki put in place when he came into office. He campaigned on a platform of reducing the personal income tax by 25%. So, and the legislature went along with that. The state then, deprived of those tax revenues from the personal income tax, sort of missed out on a lot of revenue from the economic boom of the late 1990s. As a result, the state had less money to provide to local governments in aid. They responded because school costs are increasing and so on. Medicaid costs are increasing by raising property taxes. And the state never effectively addressed that problem, so that it worsened over the years. We truly have a property tax burden problem in this state. But it's not that our overall tax burden is way out of line and too high. Again, relative to the productivity of the New York economy, it looks like we're financing the services that we need. We're just allocating the burden in a very regressive way. So the governor is talking about, well, let's cap property taxes, which is a blunt instrument approach to this problem. And it doesn't actually reduce property taxes in the near term. It only, puts a limit on how much they can grow in the future. A much better way to address the property tax burden for people like Geraldine, in the governor's state of the state. He talked about the 80-year-old woman, retiree, on fixed income. Her the value of her home is actually declining, and yet her property taxes are increasing. She's on the verge of being taxed out of her home. She's exactly the sort of person that an enhanced circuit breaker administered through the state's income tax, it would address problems for people like Geraldine. So that right now we have a circuit breaker that provides, based upon the property taxes you pay relative to your income, it provides a little bit of benefit. It doesn't provide a sufficient benefit to really allow people to stay in their homes. So it doesn't address the property tax problem. We need to enhance the circuit breaker. So it's a way that you can provide tax relief to people truly burdened in a progressive way. It costs money to do that. We have a big deficit already. But it would seem to me that you could make a very sound argument that we should continue things like the temporary surcharge on high-income people. Again, the tax burden, the overall state and local tax burden on the top 1% is less than it is for people in the middle, at the bottom, even with the surcharge in place. So if we kept that in place, or even added a bracket or two at the top, say if you add another bracket for people with incomes over $1 million or over $3 million or over $5 million, their overall, and part of this is deductible on their federal income taxes. You could pay for an enhanced circuit breaker that would provide real property tax relief today.
Yeah, but if you have no new taxes, which is the governor's pledge, and it looks like certainly Skelos and even Shelley Silver are on board with this, that ain't going to happen.
Well, but I think the governor is also sensitive to wanting to be governor of a state that has a strong economy, where unemployment is being addressed, not where it's getting worse. If, and the governor didn't have to, add everything up and show that he had a coherent fiscal and economic policy. He's going to do that in a couple of weeks. He's going to have to do that when his budget comes out February 1st. And, hopefully that in the course of negotiating this with the legislative leadership and bringing all of the stakeholders in place, not just, we have to stop demonizing public sector workers as if they're the only ones who have to sacrifice in this. I think public sector workers are prepared to contribute to a solution overall, but they'd also like to see Wall Street. They'd also like to see the top 1%. They'd like to see the Business Council of New York contribute to a solution.
Let's talk about this income tax surcharge. The governor has stated that there would be no new taxes. Would this be considered a new tax, or is this a continuation of an old one? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that, politicians make these no new tax pledges so that you have to have a discussion like this. We shouldn't have excessive taxation, certainly, but we should have the taxation that we need in order to have a productive economy and to maintain the strong productivity that we have in the New York economy. But we need to do something about the unemployment situation. There are 850,000 New Yorkers who are unemployed. Half of them have been unemployed for more than 6 months, and a significant number have been unemployed for more than a year. All studies indicate that people who are unemployed for that long a period of time, when they get reemployed, they're going to take a 20 to 25% pay cut if they ever get reemployed. So that has to be foremost. The governor really hasn't laid out an aggressive job creation agenda. He talked about the need for that in his State of the State, but his solutions were mainly we need to have 10 regional economic councils, we need to do more on green jobs and so on. That doesn't add up in the end to moving the dial on unemployment.
Yeah, but let's be realistic. We're only in the third week of the term. I mean, there's negotiations, change, and strategy. But in your mind, what is the key to job growth in New York State?
Well, I think we have to make sure that we have an adequately funded government sector. The most important thing is to maintain access to affordable public higher education.
Thank you.
Because that's the most important way to keep young people in New York. There's real concern about the outmigration of young people from New York. So we have to do that. I think we have to have much more aggressive economic development policies. We need to figure out how we can put ourselves on the leading edge of technology-related economic development. We need to capitalize on the intellectual firepower of our public and private sector universities. We need to tap in to the everyday working knowledge of our manufacturing workers. We need to figure out how to grow our manufacturing sector.
But how do you figure all of this out?
The governor has access to, very bright minds across the board. A lot of people in this country realize the challenges, the crisis that we face, and they're ready to contribute to it. Just to take one example of an area where we should have a much more aggressive, viable economic development strategy. New York, the downstate region has a large mass transit system between, the commuter rail lines and the subway system and the bus system and so on. That's a third of the mass transit market in this country. We could capitalize on that market potential by making sure that we produce more of the innovation and the equipment and the rolling stock that the MTA needs for whether it's subway cars or commuter rail cars, produce that in New York State. There are lots of opportunities to identify and develop innovative technologies that would make our mass transit system more efficient, and then to find entrepreneurs with the help of New York's universities to establish new firms, get the financing from public sector pension funds to get those new organizations, those new companies off the ground.
If they can recoup some of what they lost. So this is a big area
where we should transform the MTA into an economic powerhouse and not just a service delivery organization.
Okay.
Although it should certainly provide better service than what it does.
Right. You've argued that Wall Street is fundamentally been restructured. It is not the same Wall Street. And
no, actually, it hasn't been fundamentally restructured.
Okay, well, okay. Let's talk about that. Has it really changed, given the fact that you've got this massive influx of money into the sector, huge bonuses, et cetera? How much has really changed?
I mean, this is,
And what do the changes represent?
Yeah, this is the capital of the finance sector in the United States, if not in the developed world. We know it's sacrilegious to say anything negative about Wall Street. I was at a national.
You're a sacrilegious person.
I was at a national economics conference recently, and some people who think full time about the financial markets point out that the top 6 banks in this country have a greater share of banking assets than they did in 2006 before the crisis started. In fact, their share of GDP is much greater than what it was 20 years ago. And they don't tout that as a sign that so we have a clearly internationally, globally competitive finance system. They point that out as a warning sign that these institutions are still too big to fail. And financial reform is only going to make a small dent in that. And the financial reform hasn't given us an economy that works, even though it's restored not just financial reform, but national monetary policies, particularly the low interest rates and the bank bailouts and so on, have restored the profitability and the bonuses to the finance sector. But it certainly hasn't restored the economy and hasn't restored lending out there. And we need to have further reform in the finance sector so that we have an economy that works and not have a Wall Street sector that exists for its own profitability.
Okay. Governor Cuomo calls you up and says, James, you're going to be my economics czar. What's the first several things you tell him? That we have to take seriously jobs as the top 3 priorities. I think
he how do we do
understands
that?
Right. Okay.
So we want to keep unemployment from getting worse. So we don't want to have budget solutions that worsen the economy.
Which would include what?
Well, if you close the $10 billion budget gap by cutting it all from the spending side, we've already lost about 35,000 state and local government jobs
Right.
in New York in the past year.
And that's got a negative multiplier effect.
That has
obviously.
been, and true, this has been happening around the country. It's one of the reasons that we've had such tepid job recovery in the last year. But our rate of decline in state and local government jobs is twice what it has been at the national level. So we shouldn't make that worse. Then we also have to look at how we're going to balance the budget without making the economy worse.
$10 billion.
And we'll
we
do
get
that.
this?
I think the example that the governor laid out in terms of Medicaid reform, is a reasonable start. He didn't do that in other areas of the budget. What he
But he'll
talked
have
about,
to in a couple of weeks.
he's going to have to be very creative in a lot of areas. He didn't do that with education aid. He talked about a couple of $250 million incentive pools and so on, which I don't think are, that's not the right solution. And certainly the magnitude of the problem is well beyond that. We're going to have to figure out, are there adjustments that we can make on the revenue side that are not going to hurt the potential for long-term economic growth? And I certainly think there are some there. So, we need to figure out how to balance the budget with an eye toward putting it on a sustainable basis over the long term. I don't know that we can get there in 1 year, but if the governor is making real progress and involves all of the key stakeholders in this, he's going to have a lot of support in doing that. And people are not going to say, well, wait a minute, you didn't balance the budget this year, or you said you weren't going to borrow, or you weren't going to push the problems to next year, and so on. If he's got a credible long-term plan and dealing with issues and bringing people in and not demonizing people, I think he's going to have a lot of latitude in terms of addressing that. But he's also got to have a very proactive, realistic economic development plan. He hasn't scratched the surface on that at this point. So he needs to, articulate a strategy in terms of building on the transit manufacturing capability, building on the technology base that we have in our universities, how we can tap into the potential of keeping our people here and finding meaningful jobs for them.
So basically it's wait and see what the budget proposal is, and then wait until April 1st or thereabouts or sometime in the future to see actually how this plays out. We've got very little time. Are you optimistic about this?
Well, I thought there were a lot of positive things in the governor's State of the State. Again, he had the right approach in terms of bringing the stakeholders together on Medicaid reform. So hopefully he can do that in other areas.
Okay. My thanks to James Parrott, Deputy Director and Chief Economist of the Fiscal Policy Institute, for being on the show. For more information about the work of the Fiscal Policy Institute, go to their website, fiscalpolicy.org. That's fiscalpolicy.org. See you next week. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.